Welcome to Dead Giveaway, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of plan giving. I'm your host, Matt Treadwell. Join me as I sit down with inspiring professionals who are shaping legacies and making a lasting impact, one gift at a time. Let's dig in.
I'm Eileen Heisman, and I am in Philadelphia, and I am teaching at Penn and writing a book and doing some consulting.
Let's start from the very beginning. How did you find yourself in philanthropy?
I was always interested in making the world a better place my whole life, even as a very young child. And I ended up working in politics for the first 5 or 6 years of my professional life. And I realized that politics was a terrible way. And I'd become a political fundraiser for campaigns. And somebody said to me, "Why don't you become a charitable fundraiser?" And I didn't know what that was. So I ended up doing some informational interviews and then decided I could probably do it. And I I ended up interviewing at the Philadelphia Foundation, and I had 6 or 7 interviews. They'd never had a development officer before, and their public support test was pressure on them to raise money, from multiple individuals, and they had literally never had any aggressive, focused fundraising at all. And so I had 6 interviews, and they offered me a job, and I started doing it after doing a lot of political campaigns. And I started to try to figure out what I was going to do. What did I need to do to be successful? What does that finish line look like? And I realized that it was slow and laborious. And I started calling all my friends in the political world and saying, "Get me out of here. I got to go back to politics. I miss the speed. I miss the pressure. I miss the deadlines." And in the middle of me calling all these people, we got a single check for $650,000 in the mail, a bequest from an estate settlement. And I'd never seen a check with that many zeros before. And I remember where I was standing. I opened the mail right in the front desk, and I was standing there looking at this check on this high, high part of it desk. And I took it back to my office, and I thought to myself, I'm going to learn how to do this, and I'm going to learn how to do this really well. And I'm going to figure out where this check came from and how it got to us at this moment in time. And we deposited, and of course, I was the fundraiser, so I could take credit for the check, even though I had nothing to do with the check. And I thought, wow, if I can trigger events like this to happen and the money's going to go for charitable purposes, I'm all in. And that was in 1987. So I stopped calling my political friends. I started talking to the best. I looked at the top 10 community foundations that were raising money the fastest and the best. I scheduled interviews. This is way before Zoom, way before, cell phones, way before the internet, right? This was all paper and humanity talking to each other in real time. And I scheduled telephone interviews with the identified 10 top community foundations who are raising money. And I either talked to their chief development officer, who weren't called that at then, or the CEOs, executive directors. And I made copious notes on every interview. And then I took all the information I gathered and I put it in a plan for the Philadelphia Foundation. And I worked from that plan for the 5 years that I was there. And part of that was learning about plan giving. And I didn't know anything about it. Political fundraising is all cash all the time, not cash, but checks and money, not even wired money. Credit cards were just getting taken, like it was the very beginning. And the only people that took credit cards were political fundraisers from Texas. And we thought they were like the wild, wild cowboys. And so there I was talking to all these people and making friends as well. And I put this plan together. And the woman who was running the community foundation in Atlanta, Alicia Phillip, who's no longer there, but she said to me, "You need to take a bunch of plan giving courses or seminars, anything you can get your hands on." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "Just know it took me 7 plan giving seminars, classes, workshops." She said that some of them were 3-day before I understood the basics. So when you start taking them, if you don't understand them, just know that you should at least hit 7 and things will start to make sense to you. And I said, okay. She was really bright. She was really committed and she was good at her job. And that was some of the best advice I had. And so I ventured into the plan giving arena. I'd say some of the best places I went, or maybe the best place I went, was to the national conference. And so the idea that I'm speaking is just amazing because that national conference was really immersion in a lot of different topics. I didn't know how gifts of appreciated securities worked or why they were important. And all the life, all the split interest gifts, all the charitable remainder trusts and gift annuities, pooled income fund, all those things. And I really paid attention and I liked it. And I realized I was always interested in business. So I didn't want to go into business, but it was a really interesting confluence of my interest in making the world a better place and how assets are held and how that works and what assets donors can give. And it just was fascinating. And I'm a big, voracious learner and very curious. And it was like no two plain gifts were the same, really, especially of unusual assets. But there was such a fascination with how it worked and how it was like a learning curve that never ended, that it just kind of fed into my wanting to make the world a better place, having something that was dynamic and interesting. And then of course tax laws change. So even if you think you know something, there are new things to learn. Is really important for, professionals to know. And so that was the beginning, and I never looked back. I never wanted to go back into politics, but that one check, that one moment was a pivot for me. And I look back on that and I think, what would have happened if that check wouldn't have landed on my desk at that point in time? Then all the friends that I made by making all those phone calls ended up, some of them being mentors to me for years and years. And one of them is still alive, Jack Shakely, who ran the California Community Foundation. And I just am really grateful. I could name every single person that I talked to. That's how important they were. Fast forward, when I came to NPT, they told me my job was to raise $100 million in 3 years. I had all the workings of those 10 interviews in my head. And in my head, I said, there's no way I can do it. And then after about less than a minute, I said, I might be able to do that. Cause I thought, well, if I took my plan and I made it national instead of local, I might be able to do that. And so that was all, that formation of my thinking was all about growth. The plan giving piece was essential.
Was NPT your first plain giving role?
No, the Philadelphia Foundation was. So I spent 5 with the Philadelphia Foundation. Then I went to hospital philanthropy and I was head of plan giving at 2 hospitals, one very briefly without, just wasn't a good cultural match for me. And then I went to Abington Memorial Hospital and they were about to do a capital campaign and I was hired as director of plan giving. And at the peak, I did 81 gift annuities in 1 year. I worked on a lot of CRTs, did about maybe 10 pooled income fund gifts and was a really critical part of the capital campaign and worked with PG Calc. And on my spare time, says you what a nerd I am. I would actually, I liked to be able to calculate what people's deductions would be for their gift annuities rather than always be having my head in the computer. And so I used to run in my spare time. I used to run calculations on gift annuities, one life, two lives, the payout and their ages. So I had my own kind of calibration in my head about how I could calculate, and I would get really close, and I would like test myself. And and then I would put it in. So that was what I did in my spare time. I would go into the gift annuity program and do that. But I also was always interested in the marketing and how marketing worked. And I spent a lot of time studying about kind of gift annuity marketing, life income gift marketing. And when interest rates were higher, there was a time interest rates were really high. And of course, it was a great time to do gift annuities because the rates were so high. And, it was great. I mean, people get a deduction, and then they got income for life and they paid taxes on some part of the income, but a lot of it they didn't. And people thought it was too good to be true. And in some cases, it does feel too good to be true. So when I left the community foundation and got into the hospital plan giving, I dealt with a lot of donors directly and mostly in life income gifts. So I was able to build on my knowledge and also work with some gifts of real estate. Not too much tangible personal property at the hospital at that point. And so that was my second job. And then my third job in plan giving was the beginning of NPT, where I was just hired to raise money for the first 2 years and then was made CEO. So my first 2 years were complete immersion, working with donors. Well, first trying to attract donors, get anybody to actually call. I mean, I did a lot of national marketing at Heckerling and estate planning conferences, talking to lawyers a lot and accountants, not too much directly to donors. And so it was a lot of my knowledge about plan giving was really useful there. And so I would say that the tools that I used were built at the community foundation and at the hospital to help kind of the undergirding of NPT. And I really missed it. I mean, as NPT grew, my work directly in planned giving, started to not the first five, no, the first 10 years, I did a lot of the work directly on the gifts, like almost 100% of the planned gifts I touched. And then we hired inside counsel, and then we started hiring staff, and I started to float away from a little bit. But if I had spare time, I would go into the lawyer's office so that people who were dealing with the gifts, and I said, "What kind of gifts are we entertaining? Like, what's going on?" And our general counsel had a whiteboard, any of the top 10 prospective planned gifts that he was working on, and I would look at it and I'd say, "Tell me about them." And so, because I just loved the feel and I wanted to just know what was going on. And I missed it. I missed it. I mean, you do risk management as a CEO, you do a lot of things, but you're not really involved in frontline activities. But if I had to reinvent myself in a job again, which I'm not really doing, plan giving would be right there because it's so much fun. And I know I call it fun. It is actually fun for me. I actually will say this.
I want to kind of take a couple steps back and we'll get to NPT. So when you were at the Philadelphia Foundation and then the hospitals, what were some of the motivating factors for you to go from that first $600,000, 650,000, I think you said, $650,000 gift? You said that you start reaching out to people and learning more and starting going to conferences. So what took you from the foundation to the hospital, then to NPT? But let's start with the first part. When you started at the foundation, was it a plain giving role or was it just a fundraising role? It was just a fundraising role, right?
It was a fundraising role, but I learned from my 10 interviews that my fundraising role was essentially going to be plain giving.
Okay.
So if I was going to, it wasn't annual giving, I wasn't going to be, send us $50, a couple times a year, 100, 1,000. That really the way that community foundations were raising money at the time were a lot bequests, actually. A lot of the original community foundation money were all bequests. But at this point, the public support test demands were there. The Tax Reform Act of 69 had happened. This was 87. And so there was a pressure on the community foundations that if they wanted to meet their public support test, they were going to have to actively raise money. But it was not going to be the kind of money that like United Way, raises. It was going to be these chunks of money that eventually morphed into a very active donor advised fund model. But in 87, donor advised funds barely existed. So it was a tough thing to explain to give to a community foundation is a hard case to make. And it took me a while to figure that out. Donor advised funds were just emerging. And so I closed my first donor advised fund gift in probably 89. And I remember how difficult it was, number one. And number two, that they were so much in the shadows that it was hard to explain what they did. And there was no technology. And they could give money out. I think it took us a month to get a grant out, and everything was on paper. And even the grant, even the agreement to create the donor advised fund, it couldn't have been more difficult and complicated. I made a fill in the blank form to make it easier for donor. The first time I did it, it was like a trust agreement. It was like this 20-page trust agreement that forced the donor to go to their lawyer and have the lawyer input the agreement and then customize it. And, for any of the lawyers listening, the last thing we wanted was for every lawyer to be editing this agreement, because then you're negotiating every aspect of a donor advised fund. And there's a lot of regulatory issues that aren't negotiable, right? And so it was going to put us in a difficult situation, and there was no money to pay counsel to negotiate every DAF agreement. And there wasn't enough demand for DAFs any at the time. But so I thought, what would happen? Like, I actually thought, how can I make this easy for donors, right? And so I thought, I will work with a lawyer to create this fill in the blank. And we would like send a Xerox copy of it out. And then you'd have to fill in like Eileen Heisman, agree on this date to contribute this amount or this asset. And so it was the easiest thing I could think of that we had control over. So anything that was a discretionary choice the donor could make, we had a fill in the blank option. And then if the donors wanted to do it, they could just fill in those blanks themselves and sign it. And we could open a DAF, the amount of time it took them to fill in this form. And that was considered an advancement. I remember talking to other community foundation development people and saying, I figured out a way to make it easier. And they said, what? I'm like, I made it a fill in the blank form. Can you share that with me? That was a really common way that community foundation development people talk to each other. And in fact, there's an advancement network of community foundation development officers that I helped to launch, the National Network of Community Foundation. They used to call it the DAF. I think they call it the Advancement Network now. And one of the purposes of that is that when one of us came up with a good idea, we could share it with each other really easily. So each of us reinventing the wheel wouldn't happen. So I was trying to make it, this whole idea and fundraising and make it easy as possible for the donor to give. But the donor advised fund work was just in its nascency. And in fact, in leaving it in 2024 and starting in 1987, I was really one of the longest standing development people that had been in the field when it just was getting started. I left the community foundation because I didn't think I had enough support to raise money. And I didn't think anybody understood what I was trying to do. And I had very little resource support and very little institutional support for my work. And they were very much into the grant making, but the development side was kind of, I was on the side bowling alone. And I just wanted to be part of a team that understood and, was part of what my work. And so going to hospital philanthropy, it was sort of the opposite experience. There was a team there, a lot of people working together. It was only about 10 people in the development team, and, including support staff. But I had a great chief development officer, and the head of the hospital was really a great fundraiser. So I went from bowling alone and kind of being isolated. I often thought people thought I was minting money in the back room or something. It's great to be part of a team. And I ended up going to a team of amazing fundraising professionals and really knew what it was like to work with other people. So there was director of plan giving, and I was plan giving. There was an annual giving person, a major gifts person. There was a prospect researcher. So I went into a much more, in some ways, sophisticated and mature program. And instead of being one person, I was part of people that were really organized. We had meetings together. We had a plan. I was working from a plan at the Philadelphia Foundation, but it was very much a group. And I loved that. I loved that. And the hospital was very well run. It was a regional hospital though. And after about 5 years, I got I wanted a bigger world. The world wasn't very big. It wasn't very expansive. And then I was getting a little bit bored, and I had run into a person who was starting a magazine. I don't know if you know the magazine. It only existed for a couple of years, called The American Benefactor. And it was about donor stories. And it was a wonderful magazine. It got bought by Worth Magazine, and they never really built it further. But the whole idea is that American donors would get featured in this magazine, talking about American philanthropy to inspire other donors, talk about donor stories. And I was on the National Advisory Committee. And through that advisory committee, I heard from one of the people involved and the editor of the magazine, who I'm actually still friends with, that Pitcairn Trust Company was starting National Philanthropic Trust. And I was just at that board, enough of a board person to think, wow, it'd be interesting to get into a national, and they were calling it a national community foundation. I thought, well, I know what community foundations do, and I know what donor advised funds are, and I know about illiquid assets, and now I knew about life income gifts. Wouldn't it be interesting to take all that together and put it on a national platform? So I went and interviewed for the National Philanthropic Trust. I made a cold call, really literally, to somebody who I had met once. And they brought me in, and I told them what I knew how to do. And at that interview, they asked me if I could raise $100 million in 3 years. And I was really interested in taking all those things and putting them together. And I was young. I was a single mother at the time. But I was ambitious. And the idea of making the world a better place on a bigger stage was just super exciting. And I thought I might be able to do it. I might be able to do it. So I thought I'd give it a try. And, I knew I could always go back to plan giving. Like I knew, there's a lot of universities in Philadelphia. I knew a lot of people. I'd interviewed for a job at United Way. I didn't get the job, but I thought, you know what, there's enough out there that I could probably make my professional world successful, even if NPT didn't work. So I went over there thinking that I wasn't sure. It was a startup. When I got there, we had zero. When I left, we had 42 billion under management.
Wow. From 0 to 42 billion under management.
We had raised 63, but we had given away about 28 billion in grants. So that was an amazing trajectory from somebody, who had been bowling alone in the Philadelphia Fund. And it was a journey that was full of like fits and starts and victories and defeats that I'll never forget. But it was, it worked. I mean, and I didn't know it was going to work, but it ended up working. It was a good bet to make on myself. But it was a bet, it was a wager.
Yeah. When you went to NPT, did you know that you were slotted for the CEO role?
So I came to NPT as the chief development person, and there was a person who was the CEO, and he was the founding CEO, and he'd done a lot of the early work. But I think he realized that the visionary part of the job was not really who he was. And it's so funny. 2 years into the job, of just raising money, the president of Pitcairn Trust Company what brought me into his office, called me in, and I thought I was in trouble. I literally thought I was in trouble. And I thought, oh my gosh, what did I do? And he offered me the job. He said that the founding CEO was going to be moving to a board role, and would I consider being the CEO? And I said yes. I mean, at one point, I kind of had a feeling that that was happening. And I actually made a list of about 6 community foundation CEOs who I thought could be in a leadership role. And I had that list, and I hadn't really had a chance to share it. I knew, how you get a sense something's going on, but you don't really know what it is. So this transition, I guess, was being planned. And when they asked me, I was I was flattered. I was delighted, but I kind of still didn't know, I didn't know what was going to happen to us. I knew, I knew what community foundations could do. And, Fidelity Charitable had launched about 3 years before we had launched, or 4 years. The Vanguard had just launched about 2 years after. I mean, it was like all the nationals were coming into their own, but I knew we were different because Pitcairn Trust Company was very small and they couldn't dominate the entity. They didn't name it after themselves like the other nationals, and it did have a religious point of view. So I knew we had a niche opportunity in the marketplace. And I thought we could take advantage of that, but I didn't know how I was going to scale. And I was one person. I knew Plan Giving, and I knew the philanthropy, and I knew the community foundation world, but I didn't understand the financial services industry world well or at all. And I didn't understand the family office world. So that part of my job, I learned on the job. And and it was incremental and slow. And I would try to surround myself with people either on the board or as advisors or in my staff who came. I would hire people from the financial services world for operational things. But I didn't understand how all of that work could fit together, but I was an ardent student of it. And it was really interesting. And I never was bored a day. I had great fear of being bored in my life. And every 3 years, my job changed drastically at NPT. And we ran into a company called Giving Capital, and they had this idea to private label donor advised funds. And they were about to start their own charity. And I said, don't start your own charity. Why don't we partner in that? And so we were about 2.5 years old, 3 years old when that partnership opportunity came up, and they did. They were all tech people and salespeople from financial services, but I knew DAFs really well. And so together we went out with this idea that had never been done before, which is to offer the big financial service companies, say, that's a buy or build option. If you want to build it yourself, you can build a Fidelity, a Schwab, a Vanguard. But if you want to outsource it, we can make a DAF look and feel like it's your product, but it's really will be a partnership with National Philanthropic Trust. And not an invisible one, a visible one. And when we were out pitching, we were literally cold calling on Wall Street. And that was an unbelievable experience. And a lot through that, I learned a ton about, for the broker dealer world, the financial advisor world versus the private banking world, family offices. I didn't know any of that. And so that really rounded out my, education of what part of that industry do we want to interface with. And then the flow of money, which was, I think, the most foreign thing I ever ran into, was that advisors could get paid on assets under management inside a DAF because they could advise on the investment strategy subject to the parent entity. So I was like, I walked into a world that I didn't know what I didn't know, and just kept layering in understanding of what was going on and tried to surround myself with really smart people. And it was fascinating. And the industry was burgeoning then. And technology was, when did people start getting email? It was like in 95, 96. The technology inside the financial world started to really become commonplace in the early 2000s. And we were right there, our timing was excellent. And the growth of donor advised funds and also the use of technology and the use of marketing through digital marketing. I mean, when I got there, everything was in paper. And when I left, if you had paper, you were in the dark ages.
I'm trying to get my head around this. It was 7 years from you were by yourself, people really didn't know what you were doing, to being the CEO of NPT. Is that right?
Um, so when I left the Philadelphia Foundation, 87 to 92, and I got to NPT in 96,
Okay.
and I became CEO in 98. So I, it was, a 9-year trajectory of leaving the Philadelphia Foundation, bowling alone, being immersed in plan giving in a hospital, and then coming to NPT in 96 and being CEO in 98. And we weren't big then, we were tiny. I mean, the first year we raised $3 million. The second year we raised 11 million. The third year we raised about another 14 or 15. And then year four, we made a single get. I made a strategic cold call to an estate planning tax lawyer in New York City in 97. No, I'm sorry, not 97, around 98. And somebody had seen her speak at a conference. She was an opinion leader in the charitable planning world. And she worked at a New York law firm. And somebody told me I should really call her. So I called her and I said, my name's Eileen Heisman, and I'm working at National Philanthropic Trust, and I'm going to be in New York, in the next 2 weeks on a few different days. And could I stop in and see her and take 15 minutes of her time? And she said yes, which was pretty unbelievable. I look back now and kind of amazed. And she said, which day? And really the answer, she didn't know this, was any day you're willing to see me, I'll be there. So I said, and I gave her 3 days, and she said, oh yeah, that Wednesday works well, whatever they were. So I went up and I saw her, and 15 minutes turned into like an hour and a quarter. And I told her what my vision was for what NPT could be, the role it could play, that we were neutral with regard to investment management, that we were going to be flexible and take a lot of different kinds of illiquid assets. We could do some grant support if they needed it. I mean, I had all the elements of NPT in place, but not scaled yet. And she said she was very receptive. She really liked it. And fast forward about 8 or 9 months later, she called me, and it was a Saturday afternoon. I was in the Trader Joe parking lot with a card in my hands. And she said that she had a gift and that they needed a vehicle for it. And we had do you know type 1 supporting organizations?
Yeah. But go ahead and explain it real quick.
So type 1 supporting organizations are vehicles that lean against a public charity, and they have a board, their own subsidiary board, and their own tax ID number, but it's like but has an umbilical cord, a connection to a sponsoring public charity. And the way that the parent entity controls it is they have the majority of the board members. And so we had 4 type 1 SOs empty on the shelf, ready to go. And I had used a model that the Columbus Community Foundation had, and I had studied that model really well. And we'd gone to the IRS and gotten these 4 shelf SOs approved. They subsequently told me never to do it again. I could only get them one at a time, but they were not going to take away the approval for those. She knew that I had these shelf SOs and I had created them and they were unused. And she said she needed to use one of them. They were going to rename it and put a board together knowing that we had to have the majority. So she said, I have a donor and it's going to be $100 million. So I was like, I had my $100 million goal and I thought, well, I didn't make it in 3 years, but if I close this gift, I'll make it in 4 years. And so I said, okay. So for about 6 months, they kicked the tires. They did a lot of due diligence on us. They came down, they spoke to our board. I'm sure they did. I think they did a background check on me. They knew we were small. They knew they were going to constitute a large amount of our assets, but they liked the idea. They liked me. They liked Pitcairn at the time because we separated from Pitcairn eventually. And so we finally get to the gift amount, a gift. We're about to get the gift. It's in June, and our fiscal year ended in June. So the accountant calls me a couple of days before and he says, okay, we're ready to make the gift. And I said, okay. And he says, it's actually going to be more than $100 million. I said, it is. And, I'm so glad it wasn't Zoom at the time. I said, so what's the amount? What should we be expecting? And it's sometimes funny because I'm always training development people to be able to ask, what's the size of the gift? And a lot of them are uncomfortable when I say you need to be able to ask it. So I said, what should we be expecting? And he said, it's actually going to be $200 million. And so there we were with our $30 million, or it was actually 28 and a half or something $million of assets under management. And on June 30th, the year, I think it was 2000, we got a single gift of $200 million into a Type 1 supporting org. And that was a really pivotal moment. I think it may have been the most important moment in my career, really, because it put NPT on the map. And we got criticized for being dominated by one donor, but that didn't last for that long. But that donor was obviously really important. When we were private labeling, we could say, instead of saying we had 30 million, we could say we had $230 million of assets under management. And we worked with the donor. The donor was really an interested grant maker. He had really interesting investment strategy because it was an SO. We weren't subject to donor advised fund rules or private foundation rules. And it was a very, very straightforward, very by the book governance lesson. I mean, the people that were on the board wanted to dot all the I's and cross all the T's and not push any of the envelopes on regulatory issues. So we had a lot of compliance knowledge from the donors person who was on the board. And it was just a fascinating run. And so at that same time, we were starting to cold call Wall Street to do the private label. And this was a very high profile Wall Street donor, but we were sworn to secrecy. So I couldn't say anything about the donor. When I left NPT, 25 years later, the donor was he was no longer in an SO. He was actually he had moved over to a DAF at some point, but he was still associated with the organization. And I just look back at that relationship. I look back on my cold call to this woman, and I look back on the ability to close the gift and all the due diligence and all the homework we did. And I'm eternally grateful that, in the order of those things, they happened. And they subsequently did a lot more Type 1 SOs. But I cold called Pitcairn to interview for the job. And I cold called this lawyer to see if I could pitch her NPT services. So I take responsibility for having that willingness to do things like that. But also the patience it takes to kind of figure out how to make things work. And I just look back and when I was at NPT every day, I didn't think about what was going on that much. But when I would leave and go home or go on vacation and look back and look at what we were doing, I was always like, wow, that's a pretty cool thing to do. And as we grew and I left, we had about 200 people and we had gone global. I was really proud of the footprint that we had created and the unique proposition we had.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of my conversation with Eileen Heisman. Join us next month for part 2, where we discuss her time at NPT, the evolution of DAFs, and so much more. None of this would be possible without my amazing producer, Jessica Hall, and the support of the entire National Association of Charitable Gift Planners staff. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please share the show and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for listening to Dead Giveaway, where generosity lives on.